So there's quite a few benefits to controlling invasive plants, but to think about the benefits, you kind of have to go back to what makes an invasive plant invasive to begin with. So usually invasive plants are categorized that way because they either cause environmental harm, economic impacts or degradation, or human health impacts. And some species, have impacts to all three of those categories. So when we think about the benefits of controlling them, if we're looking at the environmental aspects of it, that might be preserving the native plant community. In turn, you're preserving habitat for native wildlife, for birds, for all the other things that are connected to those plants. If we're looking at economic benefits, the longer maybe we let an invasive species problem go, the more that it's going to cost us in the long run, or the more detrimental it's going to be to the habitat or to the resource that you're trying to protect. So economically, it's really important to control them because you're getting that benefit back, and you're getting to save those resources, whether that's your time or your money. And then when we're looking at a human health standpoint, obviously the benefit there, if we take a species like wild parsnip that can cause, second-degree burns, the benefit there is that you're really saving your own health and protecting your own health. So the benefits are wide-ranging, and it kind of varies on what species, but all around, the reason why I do it is really our native plants and animals and preserving these ecosystems and their functions for the good of all. Yeah, so it's when we think about invasive plants, they don't adhere to man-made boundaries. So we really can't look at our yard or our property in just a box. It's a good starting point, but I use garlic mustard as an example, and this is an invasive herbaceous plant that can produce thousands of seeds on an individual plant. So if I'm controlling that on my property, and I'm only controlling it right up to my property line, am I ever going to get anywhere there? I'm going to have to go back every single year because the plants just across that property line are spreading seed onto mine. So again, if you're thinking about your resources, your time and your money to do that invasive species work and to try to build habitat on your own property, the best way to do that is to reach out to the people around you and to look at that invasive species or that infestation of an invasive species as a whole and say, how can we manage all of this and not just my little piece? And sometimes I say you have to start with your little piece because that's a launching point for building on that. Sometimes you don't have the resources, the time, the money to tackle it all at once. And so starting there is a good place. But when it comes to your neighbors, I think reaching out to them, not only to control that invasive plant, but I think it also builds a sense of community around a shared purpose. And that shared purpose can not just be controlling invasive plants. It can really be creating a natural area that's more aesthetically pleasing, or a community that's more aesthetically pleasing. There can be benefits to that. I think during COVID-19 here, we've all seen that being out in nature can be really important, and it can be really good for our mental health. So having nice natural areas to spend time in can also be really important to build that sense of community. Yeah. So when I initially think about the challenges of me as a landowner reaching out to my neighbor or starting to build a group to work on these issues, it can be really intimidating if you're a beginner or a novice to invasive species control or even botany. Maybe you don't know how to ID more plants or any plants besides garlic mustard. In that case, it can be really intimidating, but I'd say don't be afraid to just go forth with the information you have, right? There's people who can help, or you can get a brochure on garlic mustard to share with your neighbors. So I think that can be a hurdle, is that it's just intimidating to approach someone else about an issue and you don't know what their response is going to be. I think sometimes it's also difficult because people have so many limits on how much time they have and what they're able to do. So I think one thing that I'll talk more about, but that I've seen works, is kind of finding a champion and maybe someone who does have a little more time to help coordinate the efforts. Some of the other challenges may be that your neighbors or other landowners, they don't understand the problem, or they don't agree that it's a problem, or they just think it's a really pretty plant because maybe they brought it in with their garden. And that can be a really hard challenge to overcome sometimes, and it might take a long time to overcome it. But education is a great way to do that, and sometimes that means stepping outside of myself as a landowner and reaching out to a local resource or a CISMA, like a cooperative weed management area or cooperative invasive species management area, to find someone with the expertise who can kind of help with that education piece. So I have kind of 3 examples of landowner groups that I've worked with in the past. So for a long time, I was the coordinator for the Door County Invasive Species Team, which is a local cooperative weed management area. And these 3 examples are kind of 3 different models that a group of landowners could use to achieve invasive species control or management. And the first of those is from some experience I have working with a group called the Clark Lake Association. It's clearly a local lake association in Door County, and they have the problem of Phragmites along their shoreline on the lake. And their association worked together to create what they called Phrag Fest, which was just a one-day blitz to tackle the phrag around the lake. So this was kind of a rallying thing that happened annually for that association, where one person was a lead for it, and they kind of spotted out where the spots were before the workday. And then during this one single day, they all came together, anywhere from 10 to 15 landowners in that association, and they provided just a quick overview of how they were going to treat it, and they went out and treated it. So it was kind of a one-time thing. It was as much about getting together with your friends in the association and having a good time as it was about doing the Phragmites control. But in the end, year after year, that one day turned into only a half day, turned into only a few hours. So they were able to really combat the Phragmites around there, still holding this annual event, still bringing people together, still having fun, but it's less and less each year. So that's kind of a model of one workday, 1 year can make a big difference over time. Another group that I've worked with that took a slightly different approach, there's an association in southern Door County along the lakeshore who also had Phragmites and some other invasive plant species. But some of the people in that group didn't have the means to really help with that. They were maybe elderly or didn't have time available. And they found a way to kind of designate a person who was willing to become certified in pesticide application. And that became their point person for the whole association. And they worked cooperatively with that one person who had the certification to kind of treat the invasive plants that they needed that certification for. So that was a little slightly different model in that it was more focused on one person working overtime. And you have to have that champion, right? That person who's dedicated to being that. But at the same time, all the landowners along there, they were educated because they were sharing information with each other. They were providing locations of invasive plants to that person to help come and treat, and really working cooperatively to talk about the problem. And I think that also started with bringing in someone to talk to their group. So sometimes that's a good launch point as well. The third example I'll give, which is like my shining example of this amazing work by a landowner group, is an association called the Shores of Jacksonport Association. And they also, you'll notice, many of my examples have Phragmites because that's the world that I work in. But they also had big problems with Phragmites along their shoreline that had really gotten out of hand when the Lake Michigan water levels were low. And they approached me as the coordinator for our management area at that time and kind of asked, what can we do about this? And they didn't necessarily have the time to control it, but they did have some financial resources from their association that they could pitch in to help with the effort. So again, there was kind of one point person who coordinated asking the landowners to report when they had Phragmites, and to kind of allow somebody to come on their land to map that. and they actually took that money and hired a contractor to come to their property and do that work. And that way, no one in the association had to go and get their certifications for that pesticide application. They had someone with expertise who was on the landscape doing it. And what I will say is the landowners who were participating in that project, who were having their Phragmites treated, in some cases, when you go in with a big group like that, the cost is much less because you have multiple landowners hiring a contractor, kind of paying a base fee, right, to have that contractor there, but then reducing the cost overall for everyone else. So because they all went in together and they all donated a small amount to the project, it cost them a lot less than having a contractor just come and treat their property. And that program was incredibly successful. I will say they started with the first year, it was, I want to say like $5,000. It was several $1,000s to do that treatment. And more recently, it's been down to hundreds for the whole association. So it's been a good way to reduce that plant infestation over time, but it's also reduced their cost. Again, economic benefit of all working together to do that. Yeah, so some of the examples I provided, they all have a starting point, which is a landowner association or an established group. And if you have that structure, that's a really, really great place to start. It gives you a forum to do the education. So for example, I would speak at the annual meeting for an association about invasive plants, and that would help get people interested and aware of the problem, and then they'd start building that dialogue around the species or what they have going on in their community or neighborhood. So again, if you have a structure there, whether it's a DMAP cooperative or whether it's just a group of landowners that know each other really well and maybe don't have any formal designation, that can be a starting point to talk to them. And I realize that not everyone has that. So in my own personal life, my husband and I bought a 2-ish acre property last year that has just its fair share of everything. We've got buckthorn, Dame's rocket, honeysuckle, you name it. And I knew it was going to be a really big project when I started. So when we started controlling on our property, my husband actually asked me, what are we going to do about that honeysuckle, which is right across the boundary of our property on our neighbors? And I said, for the time being, we're not going to worry about that. We're going to control what we can on ours. And I said, once we kind of feel good about where we're headed here, I'm willing to approach my neighboring landowner and ask them, if they want more information or if they want help doing this. And the truth is, I didn't even have to approach them because in the course of cutting out buckthorn and pulling out giant honeysuckles, our neighbor approached us and said, hey, what are you guys doing? And I think that our neighbor noticed the difference on our property. We had a nice oak woodland that we were really opening up the understory in, allowing for tree regeneration, which were all goals that we had for our property. And they saw that and they were curious about it. And as soon as we started talking about invasive species, he asked, well, what can I do? Can I help? Which was just fantastic. Like, it took all the work away from me. But I think sometimes just walking the walk can help us reach out to our neighbors in that way, right? He was first of all curious about what we were doing. We were pulling 12-foot honeysuckle out of the woods, but then also once we told him what we were doing, I think he could see the difference in the habitat that we were creating. So it can be really difficult, like I said, sometimes to reach out and have these conversations with neighbors, especially if we don't know them so well. But it's definitely worthwhile, and living by example sometimes can be a really good way to do that. There are so many resources available to landowners to help with invasive species work or to learn more about invasive species. And some of that can be as simple as starting online. I know that sounds a little cliche, but I'm the president of the Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin, and our website is really kind of built to help people if they have a plant that they don't know what it is or what to do with it. There's resources from the Midwest Invasive Plant Network that can help you both identify species and look up control methods for those species. And I am sure that Golden Sands RC&D has a wealth of resources as well surrounding invasive species. So it can be very overwhelming when you don't know how to identify plants or you don't know where to start with controlling something. But don't be afraid to branch out and ask for help and use some of those resources that are available. One really cool thing that I do every 2 years is the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference, which is more of a professionally geared conference. But I will say this year it's moving to a virtual format, also meaning it's much more affordable for maybe the average person who doesn't do this professionally. But that is a great resource if you have time to join in for 1 or 2 days of that conference or the whole thing. It's a great way to connect with information on invasive plants, both research, control, management, identification, you name it. So,
when are the dates for that?
The dates for that are November 2nd through 6th this year.